Well, welcome everyone to another session of Mike and Darren Unplugged. Um, and I thought we would begin tonight by talking, and we may do it for several nights, depending on how much material and how the spirit moves us, um, about questions about aesthetics. And specifically, Mike, I wanted to start with a question to you about the role of aesthetics, both as a theory and as an experience. And I thought an interesting place to start that conversation would be with someone you're well acquainted with, the Plato, um, in particularly in what he saw as its fraught relationship, aesthetics to ethics.
Okay. Yeah, it's a real interesting topic because generally, and I think with some justice, we often think of aesthetics as the mushiest branch of philosophy, right? It's on the other extreme from things like formal logic, right? Um, Aesthetics seems to be deeply and in some way unalterably personal, and yet it can't just be that because, well, are the things about which people claim to be having aesthetic experiences that they like and will repeat, generally includes things like recorded music or uh, downloaded music or music that's taken from Spotify, right? Very few people voluntarily turn on the vacuum cleaner and listen to it at home. So what I'm trying to do is suggesting that it can't be just a flip of the coin because there's not an equal number of people who do one and do the other. Although there's no, as far as I can tell, scientific reason why you would have to, right? Um, Maybe there's a neurological basis for it. I don't know. But my argument would be then that we can rescue aesthetics from the abyss of subjectivity without disregarding the element of subjectivity by looking for something, a cluster of meanings, what Wittgenstein called a family resemblance among things that people generally acknowledge as beautiful. In German and in French and in Latin, these will all be different terms. But the point is, all those peoples that spoke all those languages had some common unifying idea of things that they thought were beautiful. And the problem that we have now is that our lives and our minds are so hyper complex. We have such a terrific number of images and distractions. And, my phone just went off. I mean, it never stops, right? And that may impede certain kinds of aesthetic appreciation. In other words, what's beautiful about a place of worship, like, say, the Great Mosque at Istanbul or Notre Dame, Paris, is that these are not fleeting perceptions. These are not a set of images that will be gone in 5 seconds. These images actually outlast people. And
Mhm.
to look at them and to take them in, particularly the geometry of both places. For example, there are lots of others, but the aesthetics of symmetry are very powerful in Islamic mosques. And instead of having representations, realistic representations or human representations of God, what they have is extraordinarily complicated geometrical forms that repeat themselves. And what they are is the application of their new kind of knowledge, which is algebra, to the formation of these curves. So, a good part of what is beautiful, or the most beautiful things that people produce, are in the service of something that has a rather shaky connection to reality, right? And yet, nobody ever decided to build a big cathedral to F equals ma, except actually Comte, right? Who took that to Brazil and things got a little crazy there. But I mean, very few people say, let's go worship science. I mean, we like it, we don't like it that much, you see. I mean, this thing is right on schedule. So, right, I would be inclined to say that the great achievements of every culture can be found not just in their myths and in their physics and in their economics, but also in the architecture, particularly the architecture of their sacred spaces.
Okay.
So I think there's a connection between religion and the beautiful. Both are looking for some sort of transcendence, which which the world may or may not have.
Okay. Even the transcendence of the evanescent, because I think of weird one, and maybe this is appropriate for absolutely nothing, but the Impressionists were trying to capture instants which would pass, right? They would paint the same haystacks every 2 hours just to capture the change of the light.
Mm.
The same cliff 20 times just to capture, the change of clouds.
The outside of Notre Dame, too.
Exactly so. Exactly so. So in that case, they're trying to capture the impermanent.
Yeah. Well, you see, the
Or
funny thing,
is there a permanence to that impermanence? To that?
well, you see, again, here we begin to, language begins to break up and intellectual static takes over. I can try and communicate to you about this, but I'm having a hard enough time communicating to myself about this. So,
Okay.
I mean, you know,
Well, but this becomes an interesting question because um, when we think about our aesthetic experience, is it an object, therefore objective experience, or is it a relational experience where the object has to exist, but it fundamentally occurs not in the world, but in our conceptual and perceptual reaction to the world. In
okay.
other words,
Yeah, I
you know,
see. I see what you're saying.
yeah,
Is it the brain that's doing this, or is it the thing out there doing this to the brain?
or brain or mind. I don't want to,
Okay, or
insist
mind.
that we get
I
materialist.
want to slip the punch. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, this is the stuff that I've been looking at, neuro art history and uh, the history that's combined with cultural studies combined with the studies that they have of the brain and the development of neural architecture. Here's the
Mhm.
deal. Things you look at a lot and you pay attention to a lot, particularly when you're young, when you're a child. All right. As in when a tracker teaches you what the tracks of deer look like and what the tracks of raccoons look like or cougars, they're different, and you pay attention to that because your elder is teaching you this. Same sort of thing happens with writing. What it does, when we teach them the letters and the numbers and all the rest of that jazz, it actually changes the neural architecture of the brain. So now, instead of having just a fixed brain and a fixed set of outside influences, what we have is a dynamic brain that is rubbery and like, what is it like? Not Play-Doh, but silly putty. You can pull it in all kinds of different ways. And hold it, if you doubt that this exists, you and I are both in our 60s, I believe. Well, here's the deal. Do you
Yeah.
have problems with your phone making it do what it's supposed to do when children at 11 say, "Oh, give me this thing," boom, 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 and I fix it for the old geezer? All right. Now the reason why, although it seems like they're just intrinsically better suited to this, actually, it has changed the architecture of their brain. They have been so invested in this for so long that, in fact, they think differently. So now what we have is an interaction between mind or brain, name your poison, they're both horrible, and the external world. And we're modifying the external world to suit our purposes. But these modifications are changing the thing that does the modification because it modifies the brain itself. You got a feedback loop now. And that's what the Germans would have called a dialectic. And you
No,
know.
no doubt. But that's why my British friends would always have responded a la Laurence Olivier. But my dear colleagues, that's just what we always meant by learning for the last 200,000 years. That's all learning ever
uh, yeah,
was
that,
that feedback loop, right? I mean, when a kid learns anything,
mm,
I've no doubt that there are neurological changes going on. But as you point out, you can just as easily say it in mind. The question I want to get to is, because I have no doubt you're right, that there is also, there's learning to our aesthetic experience, which is why it varies from culture to culture. Um, are there certain things that are, how to put it, more universal? And I mention this because so far we've been thinking of the aesthetic as in the plastic arts, and
mhm,
you do a wonderful job with architecture. Um, but we also have the aesthetic experience of nature.
mm, yeah, that's different.
Yeah. Okay.
And when we worship something like architecture, we're showing off to God and saying, check this out. You gave us the ability and we're doing something good with it. No, this is consistent with the talents. You're supposed to do something good with your abilities. On
Mm-hmm.
the other hand, if you decide that you're going to look for aesthetics in the realm of nature, you have some kind of back to nature impulse. Um, there, you want to talk to God directly, climb on top of whatever it is you put in front of you, or go to the bottom of it, or circle around it, do whatever it is you're supposed to do. But the idea is that nature is, in some respect, um, fulfilling of a spiritual, not just a question that has to do with bragging in bars. We want to extend our tentacles, the tentacles of our experience, into the world.
Mm-hmm.
And when we do that, it offers the possibility for an amazing kind of life. If any of you've seen the movie The Alpinist, oh man, you should. I think it used to be on Netflix, but I don't know what it's on now. But there's a guy there who actually died in his mid-20s, but he was extraordinarily good, freakishly good at solo free climbing. Okay.
I think I've
So,
heard of this. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, okay. Well, when I tell you, this guy used to climb 10,000 and 12,000 foot rocks covered with ice by himself with no ropes and nobody to help him out. I mean, it must be a real bad thing to lose confidence about 8,000 feet up. You're thinking, maybe this is not such a good idea. But by then, you got to do it. There's no fooling around. So this is how he spent his life. His very short life, admittedly, but it was very much like, it seems to me, Nietzsche's tightrope walker. The guy was taking a chance every day and it killed him, but there are a few better ways to go, particularly because he seemed like he was inspired by nature. In other words, it wasn't a conquest, it wasn't a battle for him. He just said, look, I want to come up here so, I can be alone, but that means with God. And,
Yeah. That
it's
raises. So that
no,
that that allows us to circle back to our original question. What is the role of aesthetics as either theory or experience?
mm,
And one of the roles I think you're suggesting is without the aesthetic, it's hard to imagine a fully developed sense of spirituality.
yeah, I think that's true.
That to some extent, the aesthetic informs the spiritual, that they're both to some extent ineffable,
Mm,
but and experiences that are hard to, as you said earlier, capture in language, if only because they are not lodged exclusively in the object. I mean,
that's
right. So
aesthetics.
someone who finds a sunset beautiful,
Mhm.
or a beautiful sunset and the colors, would have difficulty explaining to an artificial intelligence why those particular colors are beautiful rather than some other
Yeah.
completely different configuration. But it
Mhm.
it it speaks to us in a way that, as you suggest, is not dissimilar to the aesthetic experience to the spiritual experience. And yet there are thinkers who have seen a real tension there, maybe precisely because of the affinities you mentioned, are concerned about them. So I mentioned one before, Plato, but another one, and I know we've talked about this before, and I think our audience probably like it, is the Kierkegaard's contrast between the aesthetic and the ethical.
Right, right. Two stances towards being.
Right.
And it's like batting left-handed or batting right-handed in baseball. You can't do both. Right. So when you come up to the plate, you have to get on one side of the plate or the other. It's not an option, it's a necessity. And Kierkegaard said, look, we're all born the aesthetic man. In other words, we like things that are pleasant and pleasurable, and that's natural to us. And unless we make some modification in ourselves, this is how we live and die. He said the alternative to that is the alternative offered to us by the tradition of rational philosophy in the West. And he said, call that the ethical man. Now, we could go back to Socrates to find the ethical man, but as Kierkegaard said, a good example would be Kant as well. I mean, I think very few people think that he's morally relaxed, right? That's not true about Kant. When we have the choice between the ethical and the moral, or rather the ethical and the aesthetic, the aesthetic comes first. But if we have a change of heart, we may decide to be self-renouncers, self-discipliners. We may reject the argument of Callicles in the Gorgias, and we may decide to live an ethical, moral, rational life. Now, the problem with this is that your choices don't stop there. After that, you may be asked to choose between the rational, ethical life and the life completely devoted to God. And if you decide that you want to live completely devoted to God, that means you can no longer treat reason as a God itself. It is no longer authoritative. And that means when called upon to do some highly irrational and dangerous and objectionable things, you're stuck with that. So aesthetics is dangerous, but so is ethics, and so is religion. And according to Kierkegaard, it's all a flip of the coin, right? It's rock, paper, scissors between those choices, which is deeply worrisome and also deeply destructive because, we just flip a coin, take our best shot. Everybody wants a way out of that chaos, but no one can provide it, or at least it's hard to, because if you offer a rational account of how to solve this trilemma, the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious human being, or that approach to life, whatever you choose presupposes that it's the standard by which we're supposed to choose. So if you give me a rational account of that, I have a feeling that at the end of that, you're going to end up justifying rational accounts of things. Of course you did. But if you wanted to start out assuming that the word of God and faith in God are primordial and not to be messed with by reason, then you're going to end up with something else. And how do you judge between them? Well, the problem is there isn't any decision procedure that makes sense. So I think in some ways it might be true that almost all of us are aesthetes, aesthetical human beings when we're younger. And then after a while, we're putting in some work, we may move towards the ethical life, and the religious life. I have no idea how to predict that or how to account for it. If you see people bursting into it in novels like Dostoevsky's, it never explains itself. It just shows up.
Well, but it is interesting that in the disjuncture, he places the aesthetic in tension with the spiritual, right? Rather than as upholding it. And it maybe in part it's because he sees the aesthetic as you say, pleasant and pleasurable, which is an understandable thing coming out of the previous 2 centuries of aesthetic theory.
Mhm.
Uh, but when we think about, as you mentioned, Hagia Sophia, Chartres, they clearly didn't think that the aesthetic was in tension with the spiritual. They certainly prioritized the spiritual over the aesthetic. The aesthetic served didactic purposes.
That's true. Yeah. All right.
So, I mean, that's one of the interesting sort of touchstones about, and one of the reasons I find aesthetic so, both as philosophy and experience, so fascinating, is because it doesn't seem to fit neatly into anybody's category, and however you want to put it, it will change over time.
Yeah, that's a fascinating observation. Um, you know, my sense is that the things we love and the things that we find arrestingly beautiful, if you were to chart that over time, I think that what that would be a pretty good graph of the modifications that our soul or psyche or brain has undergone over 30 or 40 years.
Mhm.
There's stuff that I thought was really great 40 years ago that I can barely stand now. Uh, on the other hand, there are things that I at one time liked and then walked away from, but now I've regained a liking for it in a different way. So my sense is that aesthetics cannot be purely arbitrary, and yet I don't think it's a good idea to have a dispute as to what the most beautiful sunset is, or symphony is, or color is. Right? I don't think
Mhm.
there's anything to say about it. Our language may just be too weak um, uh, a medium to say very much about that. On the other hand, we can gesture at things, use ostensive definitions. And that's why it's so important to be close up and personal to works of art. It just can't be reproductions. And that's why, I mean, you and I and Peter often went to MoMA in New York and the Metropolitan Museum, which is like the world's attic, right?
Mhm.
Everything is there. And you just look at these things and you couldn't help but say, that's an astonishing or enthralling thing. And what sort of culture would put that together? And, that's one of the great things about New York, but it's also one of the great things about museums. It offers us a chance
Yeah.
for experience that's firsthand, not in a book or not on a screen. And that's really important. Right.
Well, that is true. I mean, that's goes back to we were talking about aesthetics as theory, its relationship to philosophy. And you just mentioned, I think, a very important um, part of it as an experience for each individual, regardless of the peculiarities of their taste, is that to some extent their aesthetic choices and development, because um, uh, um, reflects and maybe in a certain way expresses a side of their selfhood and their personality, their sense of themselves, their identity, um, in a way, sometimes more strongly than any creedal belief.
Mm,
Right? That
yeah.
there's something particular about, this is the kind of person who likes Renoir. This is the kind of person who likes sunsets.
Mm,
This one likes Jimmy Buffett, that one likes Jimi Hendrix, right?
mm,
And there is a kind of, you know, uh, I think to some extent we forget when we first formed independent identities in our adolescence, and even before that in our high school years, how very important certain aesthetic choices were in
oh,
sort of defining ourselves.
right,
I
right.
mean, when I was in high school, there were like deadheads and guys who liked heavy metal. And
Yeah.
that was kind of like the split of the world. And there was very important choices. Were you Grateful Dead and you were still in the late 60s, or were you, more with what was going on with, I guess, Led Zeppelin or whoever it was? Or were you something different entirely? And I think that gave people a sense of their selves and bonded them in a way into communities. In a way, it probably declines over time. I mean, that's when you're first formulating and you don't know a lot of theories, you cannot say, well, I'm a consequentialist or I am a deontological guy. You still have, no, I have Black Sabbath for me, or I'm that one weird guy who listens to the Sex Pistols or whatever it is,
Yeah,
that was you, I know.
yeah, of course it was. And there's nothing weird about that.
So this comes back to what you were saying is that fascinating tension between the idea that there must be some sort of knowledge involved because it's not purely arbitrary, and yet it's not something which can be resolved with any theoretical finality.
Yeah.
So there's a very interesting, and you mentioned the paucity of our language, but the language we use, I think, really tells us about the sources of aesthetic experience, not just neurologically, maybe even richer neurosthenically. So we often speak of, particularly in the plastic arts, appreciation in terms of the word taste.
Mhm.
And hence the famed expression, de gustibus non disputatum est, right? There's no arguing about taste. And yet, and we say the same thing, obviously, about culinary taste,
Mhm.
gustatory. And yet, we also think that our palates can be cultivated,
Mhm.
right? And that we don't expect a 6-year-old to enjoy the same things as a 30-year-old.
Mhm.
That you need to expose yourself to certain things to be able to appreciate them in your palate and in your nose. And the same thing strikes me as probably true of our experience of art and maybe even the beautiful in nature.
Mhm. That's very interesting. Um, well, it seems to me that there's something fundamentally different. I don't know how to frame it, but between our experience of what's beautiful in nature and what's beautiful in culture. In other words, when I say that the Parthenon, particularly the reconstructions I've seen with all the painting, and it's really beautiful. It's a shockingly beautiful, strangely perfect building. Um, I think that the best view in the world of nature, as far as I'm concerned, is the Grand Canyon. No, I mean, and again, I don't mean to seeing it in a film or on a picture or on a screen. I mean, going to the middle of nowhere and then coming upon this and realizing what they were talking about. It redefines what you mean by big. It gives you a very good sense of how important you are in the overall scheme of things. And my sense is of being put down pretty good by the immensity of nature in a way that I didn't feel about the Parthenon. I think the Parthenon was inviting me to join all these other rational Greeks in building rational things that are perfectly symmetrical. Notice that there's a big difference, or I would argue that there's a considerable difference between the aesthetics of symmetry and the aesthetics of asymmetry. All right. Some things are beautiful because of the fact that they are coherent and symmetrical. Think of Bach's Brandenburg concertos, right? I mean, or think of Greek temple architecture, right? Now, there's a reason why all those pillars are the same size and spaced the same distance apart, because it would be a horror and asymmetrical mess if they would be up and down and separated by different intervals. Right? It destroys the spatial rhythm which demands symmetry. Okay. Now, there are other. Yeah, go
If I
ahead.
may interject just briefly, entirely agree, but I would add one word: perceived symmetry.
Right, right,
Right. Okay.
right.
Because
Because
the trick of the Parthenon is that the straight lines,
right, are
they
not really
seem
straight.
straight,
They
but
get
they're
big.
not. Right.
Yeah,
They're,
which
they're
shows.
curved to make them look straight. Right.
Mhm. Yeah, so much of human life is like that, but I won't go there just yet. Um,
Okay.
right, but it has to be symmetrical. right. You can't just take one out and say, all right.
No.
Okay. The same is true for something like Bach. All right.
Yeah.
Or if I were to look at it in terms of painting, I would say the kind of realism you get in Netherlandish stuff like Vermeer. I
Mhm.
mean, the symmetry is in fact there's a one-to-one correspondence between everybody's fingernail and the little glint that they have. In other words, it's an astonishing degree of detail. Okay, I would put against that um Dionysian art, or what I might call the aesthetics of asymmetry. You want to see something asymmetrical. Euripides' Medea. Okay, that's crazy. And Euripides kind of likes this crazy stuff. So you can go to things like the Bacchae, gets, another dose of crazy, but the moderating rational influences that allow for symmetry, like say the symmetry in the slats in the window behind you, they don't occupy the same space as Dionysus, and our drive towards asymmetrical beauty is informed by Dionysus more than Apollo. So
Okay.
here, if you think of something that's asymmetrical and beautiful, like uh, John Coltrane, right there, he's given up the inherited musical structures and he stretches out for free improvisation that goes on a very long time. If you want to move from sound to uh, to sight, then think of Jackson Pollock's paintings, all right, which don't represent anything, as being similar to Coltrane in the sense that both of them represent high points in the aesthetics of symmetry. You can't redo this. Only these guys can do this. And what makes these beautiful is that there's no structure to them. I mean, one of the things I always wondered is how did Jackson Pollock know when he was finished?
Well, that's the interesting thing is I in the case of Pollock, and I think of Coltrane too, maybe it's what separates him from, say, Ornette Coleman, is they're varying off form, but they never abandon form,
Yeah,
right? Even the long chant of a love supreme it does return to its original melodic signatures. And Pollock, if you look at most of his drip paintings, um, you begin to notice there is a fairly common rhythm to the drip of different colors. And it's not like, well, all the reds are here and all the blues are there. No, he's pretty much got a common pattern there. And there are places where it's more intense. Um, so, I think you're right. It's like, using dissonance to
that's
contrast
exactly right.
to consonance.
Yeah, this is energy made visible.
The which raises another question, and I hate to keep raising questions, but
Good.
that's what it's for, is
Yeah,
we've been talking so far about in aesthetics about the beautiful and putting everything into the beautiful, different slices of the beautiful. But
yeah,
one of the doctrines of aesthetics that emerged starting probably 16th, 17th century, but really took off in the 18th, was the contrast of the beautiful and the sublime
yeah,
as two distinctive aesthetic experiences. And maybe, the question we're asking is, or I don't know so much in the case of Coltrane, but probably more in the case of Pollock, at least for me, um, is what is the relationship between them, and is there a hierarchy
yeah.
between I'm not saying an inherent hierarchy, but in the same way that taste changes within an individual's life, taste
Mhm.
changes within a culture or civilization as well.
That's true.
And if you read um, Burke on the beautiful and the sublime in the 18th century, and he uses language very similar to yours, to what you said, the symmetry and asymmetry. He thinks that the beautiful is essentially um, literally like neurasthenic experiences of things that are smooth, small, self-enclosed, that make one feel sort of safe and part of an ordered world.
Hmm.
And the sublime is the huge, the vast, exemplified in, cliffs, and it induces terror and fear. And in his hierarchy, the beautiful is the desirable state. The problem is, after a while, the beautiful produces a sort of enervation. And so the neurasthenically, we need to sort of get jolted up by a shot of the sublime, which gets our juices running, and then we can go back to the beautiful. And to me, as I read that, I can't help thinking, okay, I know what he means by the beautiful. He means Fragonard. I mean, you
Okay.
do
Oh, I do
architecture.
know what that is. It's like a lovely piece of French cake.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
overdone, but perfect.
It's the ideal modern Rococo style of gentle swirls. It's essentially feminine.
Yep.
Soft. It's intensely pleasurable. It's all
Yep.
about physical, tangible pleasure. And then every so often you need a little Blake.
Yeah.
Because you don't want to fall asleep looking at Chardin. He'll put you to sleep, or Gruz, or whoever, or
Well, I don't
Fragonard.
know about Blake. I think maybe we need Herman Melville or somebody
Well,
equal.
he's a much later Sublime, but I mean
Okay.
someone that would have been more or less in the same time period.
Yeah.
Then you get to Kant, and Kant has obviously read Burke. Kant's read everyone, and
Yeah.
he sees the same categories, but he thinks that the higher of the two is the sublime, right? And that the beautiful is, well, you can't be sublime all the time because you'll have a brain meltdown. But so every so often you have to refresh or soften with the beautiful. And in some ways, that's a fundamental turning point in the experience of individual aesthetics. One thinks of it in terms of, you know, um, two contemporary painters. I always fall into painters,
Mhm.
sorry. You
Sure.
can put in architects. Constable
Yeah.
is beautiful. Turner,
Yes.
line.
I was just going to come to that. In other words, the world is such a fog. Is that a ship out there or is that a cloud? Who knows? Who cares? I feel such uncertainty, yet I feel an identity with the churning sea. I mean, it's romantic, 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 built upon itself. And look, I think Turner's seascapes in particular are really beautiful, because they don't have.
Or are they really sublime? Or is
Oh,
or
right.
is
No, that's a good way of putting it. Yes, exactly. Are they sublime? Um, it's hard to know what to invoke with an artist like Turner, because he could. I mean, what you're seeing may be a ship or may have some connection to people, but you're not always 100% certain, right? So his seascapes are open ended, and at least some of the time. And then we're going to have to provide some background in order to think about it in those terms. What I would emphasize is that the aesthetics of symmetry and the aesthetics of asymmetry feed off one another. In other words, the romantic period is deeply invested in the idea of asymmetry, right? Things don't work out the way they're supposed to. The world is not logical. We are not mechanical. Nobody likes utilitarianism. There's a whole bunch of things that are a kind of rejection of the Athenian tradition. Now, the question is, what are you going to get instead? And well, in the 16th century, what you get is people killing each other over religion. What you get in the early 19th century is the romantic reaction to the Enlightenment. And
yeah.
then what we get from, say, I don't know, roughly between, let's call it 1905, Einstein's special theory of relativity. What we get here is a wholly new epoch. And what it is much more like the old uh, Enlightenment, in the sense that there's a focus on technology and instrumental reason. But paired with this is an unlikely self loathing and self hatred, because they don't know. I mean, the West is a culture that's disoriented. I might be tempted to say it has PTSD ever since we beat ourselves up. I mean, like hitting ourselves with a hammer. Every one of the big Western countries in the middle of the 20th century, and then it turns out that in the second half of the 20th century, all of high culture, particularly stuff that's coming out of there, is completely deranged. I mean, there's some crazy stuff going on.
Well, I would, yeah, I
But
know. I'm tempted to say, hold that thought and let's do this in another session, which is the question of what do different movements, aesthetic theories and artistic movements tell us about the development of a culture and a civilization. So, I mean, I think it's a critical question. What's fascinating, and I'll just drop this and then we won't do any more with it and go back to our previous Beauty and Sublime, is 1905 is also the year that Picasso created modern art with what is it, the Mademoiselle d'Avignon, right, which is the first painting expressly meant to be ugly.
yeah,
I mean, and is like a magnificent development in history. I mean, it makes modern art because it is incredibly powerful. You can't ignore its importance. And it is self-consciously a man that could produce great beauty. Ugly. I mean, when Matisse saw it, he said, you can't ever let someone see this. Right? This ruins all of art forever. You have beautifully produced ugliness and a celebration of and mean-spiritedness. So,
he's really hard on those ladies. If I might just finish with a painting that is dear to my heart. Lucian Freud spent a lot of time copying Velasquez, particularly a looming sort of a Spanish Velasquez portrait of Innocent X. All right. And to say that Innocent looks grave doesn't really do justice to it, right? He's got a poker face in a culture that doesn't have poker, all right? So he's sitting there, being eminent and everything and holy and all the rest of that jazz, but also deeply serious. And this man makes me very nervous. Now, Lucian Freud in the early 50s starts to reproduce this in weird ways, in a much more artistic and painterly way than, say, Andy Warhol and his blasted soup cans. That's much more underwhelming than Lucian Freud's portraits. But one of the portraits in particular, it's of there's no papal crown. The Pope is bald. He's covered in by these by these gold. So I don't know to know if they're ropes or what they are. And he's screaming and he's stuck in the chair as if he's being tortured. All right. And this is 1953, but I'm thinking, man, the zeitgeist is right on the money. Do you know who this looks like to me? Foucault. Go back and have a look at that bald head that he stole from Genet. Right? He's Jean Valjean turned inside out. Hi, I'm the bad guy. Gets away with it. Ha ha ha.
Well, but here we get to something interesting, which is that that art is being used as a moral/political cudgel.
Yeah.
Which brings us back to the ancient world, because you mentioned the Athenian tradition, but there ain't one Athenian tradition, is there? Because your man Euripides was also from Athens.
You see, that's why I need you to keep me honest. Of course.
Well, so I mean, but that was in some ways what led, I think, Plato following Socrates to mark out a fresh path for philosophy. Was not only in distinction from the nature physis talk of the pre-Socratics and the pure metaphysics of the Eleatics, but also from the heavy weight that art and particularly poetry swung around in ancient Athens and in ancient Greece. that in some way those aesthetic experiences and those the people who could produce it in art carried a moral, political, and spiritual weight that I think Plato found terrifying, and to that extent needed to create a counterweight to.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, Plato is active, constructing a way out of the impasse of pre-Socratic physics, and
But
he
he's also concerned about Homer.
oh yeah. Well, you see,
Yeah.
that's part of it. Pre-Socratic physics, and here I mean not Thales, but pre-Socratic physics is actually encoded in Homer, right? So Homer is passe now among the more intelligent classes, but the question is what to fill the gap with. Sophists want to impose sophistry and sell that skill to willing young men. Socrates wants to replace it with philosophy, and he offers that to willing young men for free. The cost is, of course, your soul. So I'm while I agree with you that there's more than one Athenian tradition, I think that there's a strange merging in the third generation of the Periclean Athens, in which we find both Socrates and Euripides. Both of these guys are ironists par excellence, and both of them are ironic in a way that would have seemed very foreign to somebody like Aeschylus 50 or 60 years earlier. So I think you're right. The big picture, irony always means that the culture that's producing it, or the cultural trend that's producing it, is dying.
Or at least it's undergoing a transformation.
Yeah,
Becoming
like you do when they bury him.
it could be a burial, or it could just be a mutation. Consider to some extent the you know it, I, one way of thinking about it would be the Platonic reaction to the Homeric past and the sophistic challenge is you use the word dialectic. It's a growth out of that, just as that will then interact with. I mean, because the problem with the Platonic critique, which is wonderful, of the inherited aesthetic / religious tradition, is that its aesthetic is so cultivated that not more than 1 out of 1,000 people will ever find it particularly satisfying. I mean, it just won't. And so what you get is a re-aestheticization of that tradition in Neoplatonism as part of a larger and more diffuse Hellenism, whose aesthetic expression in statuary is more like the sublime than the beautiful.
Yeah, I don't think at that time they had fully separated nature and culture. The Sonderstellung, which we're going to get with the advent with Christianity in particular, where we have souls but the other beasts don't, and all the rest of that sort of thing. That's why you're going to see an embrace continuing between nature and culture in both Greek and Hellenistic art. I think it's after we get Christianity that we're going to see a separation. No more nature divinities. We're going to actually make our art representative of people that we think are moral paragons. So, saints and martyrs and that sort of thing. And that means that Christianity fulfilled Plato's desire to have art reflect a moral understanding of the world. Aesthetics, in other words, is to be governed and disciplined by ethics. Right. Both Plato and the Christians believe that. People like Nietzsche, or people like the sophists, or if you were to look at similar aesthetes like Baudelaire, those of you who know the Fleur de Mal, okay, that's some pretty perverse stuff. I have to admit, I really like it. I feel like it's a guilty pleasure. But here's someone that is on the dark side, And he's not the only one in the tradition, but no tradition could primarily be constructed of people who veer in that direction because it's antisocial and it destroys itself.
Well, it doesn't. Let me allow me to dissent there a little bit. I don't think it
Good.
has to be a dark side or antisocial. I'll give you an. What you said was like setting off bells in my ears. I think you're exactly right that one of the things Christianity is doing in its representational art, it wants its art, at least in the medieval period, to be didactic.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, this is wonderfully expressed in the popularity of what I call the Byzantine style, which is the portraits of Madonna and Child, of saints. There is no attempt to be physiologically accurate because that's not the point. The
Right.
point is to show these figures, and very often the backdrop is gold
That's right.
to express
Right.
that this is not of this world.
Right.
So consider then, in a certain way, the answer to that is Giotto,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
Is Michelangelo, is Raphael, and particularly the most extreme, and the one you mentioned before, is the Dutch, who actually don't just use realistic landscapes to show biblical stories or characters. They'll take the whole biblical story and character out and just give you the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that, I don't know if that's necessarily anti-Christian, but it is certainly redeeming in a certain way nature.
Yeah.
And I don't
It's a
think it's
positive
coincidental that that's
representation.
during. I'm sorry.
It's a positive representation of nature that would have been shocking given the context. It's a little bit like Vico's oration concerning the dignity of man. Here we have these paintings that are about the dignities of trees and mountains and stuff. But we know that the earth is fallen. And instead of flagellating ourselves, we got a guy here who wants to show us how beautiful nature is. Think of Petrarch's ascent of Mount Ventoux so he could get a big perspective on the great wide world. That's true part of this spirit, I think, of finding nature more congenial and less worthy of reflexive rejection than you might have seen 3-4 centuries earlier.
And I think part of that has to do, and part of what we mean by that movement of humanism is the critique, the Christian critique of nature was also a Christian critique of the human, the non-spiritual elements of humanity, right? That man is essentially a fallen creature.
Yeah.
And that he needs to, as much as possible, reject his natural inclinations or her natural inclinations to escape the tyranny of the physical force. And here we're seeing, no, there is a possibility that man, if man can be integrated into nature and nature can be in its own way beautiful, not yet sublime, because I think the sublime in a weird way circles back to the medieval, which is why sublime artists of the 19th century and romantics are all pre-Raphael.
Runes and everything, right?
Right. They want they want that contrast because it gives you high drama.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know?
Right.
But I think that the attempt to reconcile them in the Renaissance and through the High Renaissance, so obviously there's some tensions after that, and Mannerism and Baroque, is an important part of the recapitulating the dignity of man, which is what the Renaissance wants to argue was key to Athens. And I think here, to complicate it with another genre of Shakespeare's a speech that Hamlet gives to the players before they do the mousetrap play, when he says, "Hold up the mirror to nature." Right. That's what's beautiful in art, is that
But nature still
accurate.
includes human nature.
Hmm?
Right. But nature
Well,
still includes human nature.
that's exactly right. So when you hold up the mirror to nature, you are seeing human, and no doubt there's a dark side to it, but there's also much to be celebrated, at least in that account. It is interesting when you get that. What are those moments when you can sustain that kind of a confidence, which clearly Lucien Freud can't? I mean, he just can't. He can't look no more than Francis Bacon can he look at the human and say, "I like that.
Yeah.
That's a good thing," you know. And that's fascinating that you reach a moment where the artist feels that way authentically. It's. I don't think he's putting it on, for commercial
Yeah,
purposes.
I'm one of those guys. I don't care if it's authentic or not, but I do care that he's raising the intentionally ugly, the intentionally terrifying, uh, in a way that reminds me of Kafka, right? And Lucien
Mhm.
Freud. And the portraits are someone bound in and screaming, but unable to free themselves. And it's a deeply moving set of portraits. I mean, he kept coming back to this Velasquez and doing it and redoing it and redoing it. And it's worth looking up if you get the chance. But
Mhm.
the world of Foucault is the world of the Freudian infant, where uh, all obstacles to libido are the enemy, and eventually they just get tossed into a general junk drawer called nature. So the idea then is to abolish nature, but the problem is then you're left with a prison of your own devising. You're trapped by your own liberating ideas, and there's no way out of the permanent stasis of the stance that we get in postmodernism. If you remember the movie with Marlon Brando, what is the motorcycle? I forget what
Oh
it
yeah,
was.
the wild one.
Right, yeah, the wild one. But so, he says, "What are you rebelling against?" And Marlon Brando says, "Well, what do you got?"
That's
It doesn't make any difference. I want to destroy something. So this is what connects the Sex Pistols to say Foucault. There's a general sense that we can destroy things much to their advantage, and we're not too picky about what or why. So yeah, we've come to the end of a historical epoch, and the other great thing about this is we come to the end of our hour. Okay, I'm looking at that.
Ah, indeed,
But
you're correct. So
before you dive away, you can give whatever you want, but I'm going to look and see what I can do to get you a drinking horn.
okay, excellent. So and we have much more to cover because we clearly feel the need to start moving towards the next moment in historical development of aesthetics, which is the
Virgil.
contemporary moment. So let's think about that and maybe sit down and you get your drinking horn going, and I'll figure out something on my end, and we'll pick this back up again.
All right, I may have to sign you send you a whole steer, but the deal is I'm happy to get you a drinking horn, and there's lots of good stuff we can say about aesthetics. All right, good night.